The Battle of Gettysburg, fought from July 1st to July 3rd, 1863, was a pivotal moment in the American Civil War and marked a significant turning point in the conflict. Located in southern Pennsylvania, Gettysburg became the site of the largest and bloodiest battle ever fought on American soil. The battle pitted General Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia against the Union's Army of the Potomac, commanded by General George G. Meade. The stakes were incredibly high, as Lee hoped that a Confederate victory on Northern soil might force the Union to negotiate peace or even encourage foreign intervention. However, by the end of the three-day battle, it was clear that the Union had achieved a decisive victory, one that would have far-reaching consequences for both sides. The lead-up to Gettysburg began in June 1863 when Lee launched his second invasion of the North. After his successful victories in Virginia, including the stunning Confederate win at Chancellorsville, Lee believed that taking the fight to the Union territory could relieve pressure on the South and give his army access to fresh supplies. Lee also hoped that a Confederate victory on the Northern soil might weaken Northern morale and strengthen calls for peace within the Union. Lee's army crossed into Pennsylvania in late June, pushing northward as Union forces scrambled to intercept them. The two armies finally met in the small town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, where the stage was set for one of the most important battles of the war. The battle began on July 1st, 1863, when Confederate forces under General A.P. Hill clashed with Union cavalry led by General John Buford just outside of Gettysburg. Buford's troops, though outnumbered, held off the Confederate advance long enough for Union reinforcements to arrive, and by the end of the first day, both sides had gathered significant forces. The Confederates pushed Union forces back through the town of Gettysburg, but the Union Army regrouped on strong defensive positions on Cemetery Hill and Cemetery Ridge. On the second day of the battle, July 2nd, Lee attempted to break the Union line by launching assaults on both the Union left and right flanks. Fierce fighting took place in locations that would become infamous, including Peach Orchard, the Wheat Field, Devil's Den, and the Little Round Top. Union forces under commanders such as General Winfield Scott Hancock and Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain fought valiantly to hold their positions. Despite heavy Confederate attacks, the Union line held firm, and by the end of the second day, Lee's plan to turn the Union flanks had failed. With his earlier assaults repelled, Lee made the fateful decision to launch a massive frontal assault on the center of the Union line on the third day of the battle. This assault, known as Pickett's Charge, became one of the most famous and disastrous events of the entire Civil War. On July 3rd, after a massive artillery bombardment that was intended to soften the Union defenses, Lee ordered General George Pickett and approximately 12,000 Confederate soldiers to charge across an open field and attack the center of the Union line on Cemetery Ridge. The Confederates advanced bravely, but they faced withering fire from Union artillery and infantry. As the Confederates crossed the open ground, they were decimated by cannon fire and musket volleys, with an entire ranks of men falling in the onslaught. Despite their bravery, the Confederate soldiers were unable to break through the Union line. Pickett's charge ended in failure, with heavy Confederate losses. Of the 12,000 men who participated in the charge, more than half were killed, wounded, or captured. Pickett's charge marked the end of the Battle of Gettysburg, and it was a devastating blow to Lee's army. Lee, realizing that his army had been beaten, retreated back to Virginia on July 4, 1863, the same day that the Confederate stronghold of Vicksburg fell to Union forces in the Western Theater. The Battle of Gettysburg was a decisive Union victory, but it came at a tremendous cost. The battle resulted in approximately 51,000 casualties, including killed, wounded, and missing soldiers from both sides. It was the bloodiest battle of the Civil War, and the high casualty figures stunned the nation. For the Confederacy, Gettysburg was a disaster. Lee's army, which had been seen as nearly invincible after a string of victories in the Eastern Theater, was forced to retreat back into the South, marking the end of Lee's invasion of the North. The defeat at Gettysburg dealt a severe blow to the Confederate morale and weakened the Southern war effort. For the Union, the victory at Gettysburg was a much-needed boost. After suffering numerous defeats in the Eastern Theater, the Union Army had finally won a decisive victory over Lee's forces. The success at Gettysburg, coupled with the victory at Vicksburg, marked a turning point in the war. The twin victories gave the Union momentum and put the Confederacy on the defensive for the remainder of the conflict. In addition to its military significance, the Battle of Gettysburg would come to be remembered for one of the most famous speeches in American history, the Gettysburg Address. On November 19, 1863, just a few months after the battle, President Abraham Lincoln traveled to Gettysburg to dedicate a cemetery for the soldiers who had died in the battle. Lincoln's speech, delivered in just over 2 minutes, had become one of the most iconic speeches in American history. In the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln framed the war as a struggle not just for the preservation of the Union, but for the principles of liberty and equality upon which the nation was founded. He famously stated that the United States was founded on the idea that all men are created equal, and he argued that the war was a test of whether a nation conceived in liberty could endure. Lincoln honored the soldiers who had fought and died at Gettysburg, calling on the living to dedicate themselves to the unfinished work of ensuring that government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth. The Gettysburg Address was significant not only for its eloquence, but also the way it was reshaped the meaning of the war. Lincoln's speech transformed the conflict from a fight merely to reunite the country into a struggle for a birth of freedom, one that would bring an end to slavery and ensure that the United States lived up to its founding ideals. The speech also reinforced the Union's resolve to continue the fight, even in the face of heavy casualties that had been suffered at Gettysburg and elsewhere. The Gettysburg Address remains one of the most powerful expressions of American ideals and continues to be studied and revered today. The psychological impact of Gettysburg on the Confederate Army was profound. For Robert E. Lee, Gettysburg was the first major defeat of his career as commander of the Army of Northern Virginia. Lee had built his reputation on bold and aggressive tactics, and his successes at battles like Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville had given the Confederacy hope that it could win the war. However, the defeat at Gettysburg shattered the aura of invincibility that had surrounded Lee and his army. The Confederate losses at Gettysburg were staggering, and many of Lee's best officers and men were killed or wounded in the battle. The failure of Pickett's charge, in particular, weighed heavily on Lee, who took personal responsibility for the defeat. Lee's army never fully recovered from the losses it suffered at Gettysburg. Although the Confederacy would continue to fight for nearly 2 more years, the defeat at Gettysburg marked the beginning of the end for the Southern war effort. Lee's army would remain on the defensive for the rest of the war, and it would never again be able to mount a major invasion of the North. For the Confederate soldiers who survived Gettysburg, the defeat was a devastating blow to their morale. Many Confederate soldiers had believed that they were on the verge of victory, and the loss at Gettysburg dashed these hopes. As Lee's army retreated back into Virginia, it became clear that the Confederacy was fighting a losing battle. The psychological toll of the defeat, combined with the growing shortages of supplies and manpower in the South, made it increasingly difficult for the Confederate Army to sustain the war effort. The aftermath of Gettysburg also had significant implications for the overall course of the war. While the Union had achieved a great victory, General Meade faced criticism for not pursuing Lee's army more aggressively during its retreat. Some in the Union high command believed that Meade had missed an opportunity to destroy Lee's army completely, which could have brought the war to a swift conclusion. Despite this criticism, Gettysburg was still a turning point in the war. The Union now had the upper hand, and the Confederacy was on the defensive in both the eastern and western theaters. The victory at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, coming just 1 day apart, gave the Union the momentum it needed to press forward and eventually achieve victory. The Battle of Gettysburg, Pickett's charge, and the Gettysburg Address remain a defining moment in American history. The battle was a critical turning point in the Civil War, and its outcome helped set the stage for the eventual defeat of the Confederacy. Lincoln's Gettysburg Address not only honored the sacrifices of those who fought and died at Gettysburg, but also redefined the meaning of the war, emphasizing the importance of liberty, equality, and democracy. The psychological impact of Gettysburg on the Confederate Army, combined with the Union's growing strength, signaled the beginning of the end for the Confederacy. Although the war would continue for nearly 2 more years, the defeat at Gettysburg marked the turning of the tide. For the Union, Gettysburg and the Gettysburg Address symbolized the hope of a united nation and a future free from the stain of slavery. For the Confederacy, it was a bitter realization, and their aspirations for independence were slipping away. The psychological impact of the Confederate Army extended beyond the battlefield. Morale in the South began to falter as soldiers and civilians alike faced the grim reality that victory may no longer be attainable. The heavy casualties at Gettysburg, combined with the simultaneous loss at Vicksburg, left the Confederacy reeling. Many soldiers who believed in their cause and in the invincibility of their leaders, especially Robert E. Lee, began to question whether the war could still be won. While Lee remained a respected and beloved leader among his men, the defeat at Gettysburg cast a long shadow over his command. The psychological toll was not only felt by the Confederate Army, but also in the homes and communities of the South. News of the defeat spread quickly, and the realization that the tide of the war had shifted in favor of the Union was difficult for many in the Confederacy to accept. The loss of so many men at Gettysburg, particularly during Pickett's charge, left families grieving and communities struggling to cope with the human cost of the war. As the Confederacy faced mounting challenges including shortages of food, supplies, and manpower, the defeat at Gettysburg made it clear that the Southern war effort was in jeopardy. The battle also had lasting effects on the political landscape for the Confederacy. While the Confederate President, Jefferson Davis, continued to insist that the South could achieve victory, there were increasingly calls for peace within the Southern states. Some Confederate politicians and citizens began to argue that it was time to seek a negotiated settlement with the Union, though Davis and other hardliners rejected the notion of surrender. In the North, the victory at Gettysburg bolstered support for the Union war effort and President Abraham Lincoln's leadership. The battle, along with the Gettysburg Address, helped to galvanize Northern resolve to see the war through to its conclusion. Lincoln's speech not only honored the fallen, but also reaffirmed the Union's commitment to the principles of democracy and equality. The Gettysburg Address gave the Union cause new meaning, casting the war as a fight not just for national unity, but for the very ideas upon which the United States had been founded. As the Union Army regrouped and prepared for future campaigns, the momentum gained at Gettysburg would carry them through the final years of the war. The victory at Gettysburg, combined with the leadership of Ulysses S. Grant, who was soon promoted to command all Union armies, allowed the North to continue pressing the Confederacy on multiple fronts. The Union's coordinated strategy, with Grant leading the effort in the Eastern Theater and General William Sherman conducting his devastating campaigns in the Western Theater, further weakened the Confederate war effort. The aftermath of Gettysburg and its psychological impact on the Confederate Army were felt in every subsequent battle. No longer able to mount large-scale offensives in the North, Lee's army was forced into a defensive posture, trying to hold off Union advances. The loss of men, resources, and morale at Gettysburg left the Confederacy struggling to recover. Over the next 2 years, the Union's relentless pressure, combined with their strategic advances gained at Gettysburg and Vicksburg, would eventually lead to the collapse of the Confederate war effort. By April 1865, after a series of increasingly desperate battles and sieges, Lee would surrender to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, effectively ending the Civil War. The Battle of Gettysburg, therefore, stands as one of the most significant moments in American history. It was a battle that marked the turning point of the Civil War, a victory that gave the Union the upper hand, and then a defeat that signaled the beginning of the end for the Confederacy. It was also a battle that left a profound psychological impact on both sides, one that tested the resolve of the Confederate Army and inspired the Union to continue its fight for a nation united under the principles of liberty and equality. The legacy of Gettysburg, along with Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, continues to resonate in American memory, symbolizing both the cost of the Civil War and the enduring values that the nation sought to uphold.